Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to Pinball Arcade. I've been noticing while I was playing with this that the controls for the controller are not quite perfectly programmed. So you can, for instance, on the D-pad, go left and right and select each one. It's not so bad that you would accidentally jump over one no matter what. And I've certainly seen other programs where that happens. But on occasion, you do get like this double punch, and more consistently, if you just hold the button down, it just moves a little too fast. Where if I was to try to stop here on Big Shot, for instance, while holding it down, there's just no way. But if I slightly tap, it will work. Now, does that really matter that much? No, because at the end of the day, we're going to just be playing pinball with the left and right triggers anyway, so D-pad input doesn't matter. And I don't think there's much of a importance on how the controls control in the menu as much as there's an importance on how the controls control in the game, and so far I've seen them working perfectly. So today we're going to look at Spanish Eyes, which came out in 1972. I assume that these tables are in chronological order, even in the 70s era category. Otherwise, they're in random order, because I doubt they are. They can't be in alphabetic order because Spanish Eyes is before Big Shot. It's a distinctive table designed by Norman Clark with art drawn by John Craig. I imagine we'll run into a lot of names here I don't recognize. This fast-paced table is unique, designed with a bumper in between two widely spaced flippers, making an excellent game to practice nudging to keep the ball in play. Complete the letters A, B, C, D, E, and 1 through 6 targets to build your score before shooting the valuable center loop and saucer, but always keep your eyes open. Sharp reflexes lead to huge scores on Spanish Eyes. 3,905 units were produced. We are seeing more units of pinball tables being produced. But it is worth mentioning these numbers are ridiculously low. Like, if only slightly less than 4,000 units of this table were ever made, and this is a wooden era table where a significant number of the tables would have been burnt, and it just being old, it probably would have been thrown away. You're talking maybe 500 units left in the entire world, maybe a lot less than that. So imagine, as far as extras, looking at the flyer might be the better move. Let's see, how do you scale up? You have to highlight the scale up first to zoom in. Honestly, it should just have an animation that zooms in by default. There is definitely some things about pinballs, even in the early 70s, that had been fairly established. The coin slot squares the same size, the plungers in the same place, flippers are in the same place. The actual physical dimensions of the outer cabinets, mostly the same. Backboards changed over time, particularly once they started getting more electronics and LCD screens in there, whereas old tables like this would have all been done with mechanical technology closer to a jukebox. But they never decided to make tables as a new standard smaller, which you would almost see in modern days something like that happening. I know the Super Mario Bros. Pinball table is actually a custom length and different, but that's really a gimmick, and every pinball table really does have its own little gimmicks built around it, but usually the gimmicks stay just on the playfield part of the table, and that way you could easily repaint the sides or just paint the sides black and put in a different table. And certainly that is what happened to a lot of pinball tables too, is you may have a cabinet that is from the 60s or 70s that then got turned into a table from the 80s or 90s over multiple times. We're going to try and turn on the green pop bumper, complete the U-turn, complete ABC, complete 1 through 6, and score 80,000 as our main goals. This, I believe, is one of these tables where your multiplier and your score gets kind of locked in. So it's not so much a case of just, wow, this is different. The bumper's right in the middle. Yeah, I can definitely see why they would have focused here on nudging. The flippers are much higher up on the play table than they normally are. And the central feed is what you're really going for. This is still kind of in the era where you can get 10 points, maybe even 1 point somewhere. I suspect not, though. I bet they started just adding zeros at the end. That would just really save the mechanical components. Pinball machines being originally just full of very expensive mechanical components, it would be very easy for them to simply put a 0 at the end and make it look like it changes, but never have a scenario where it actually does change. And they painted the side there to make it almost seem like there is a side flipper. Wow. That was a pretty pathetic first game. It looks like there almost would be side flippers back in that section, up in that upper player field. This is very unique, and in a funny way, this is what you can get between a lot of pinball tables. Even if it is a bad pinball table, which I honestly would say this probably is a pretty bad pinball table in general, because the upper play field is extremely limited, the lower play field is super empty, and you're wasting a significant amount of space by having the flippers and the bumper take up that bottom section. But yeah, you can see as you're lighting up things, that center drop down target gives you a higher score. So there's one very specific goal here to specifically get your get that multiplier and get the A, B, C, D, E and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all lit up, and then sync in the middle for the maximum score, which it probably would be fairly difficult to accomplish the standard goal of the high score without accomplishing that goal. When I'm flipping the flippers on this table, the ABCD at the top is not changing. You can see falling down that under the flipper is fairly common. So it's going to be incredibly more difficult than normally speaking to fill out ABCDE. That you really would have to skill shot it, because there's basically no way. Same is true for the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is that there is just not actually a way to get there. And see, I could get particularly good at hitting that same shot over and over again, but it still may not in a reasonable amount of time give you all the points you would want. Also, up until this point, every game has been 5 balls. And I don't think that's because I just bought the pro modes of these tables, and thus it gave me 5 balls instead of 3 balls, which by the time I was playing pinball, it was very much 3 balls. And certainly that is something that you could have, any arcade owner could have adjusted, but they weren't likely to bother to adjust it, and if they were going to adjust it, they were going to adjust it in a negative way. Let's see, almost got the score up there. My nudging skills still pathetically bad. These flippers making the buzzing sound still, and not really feeling very powerful. The plunger doesn't feel very powerful. The flippers don't feel very powerful. We're not seeing anything by modern standards as far as a countdown pity timer if the ball drains in the first like 5 seconds of a game, or the first 30 seconds of a game, where you will see elements of that in more modern games. I suppose this is a predecessor idea, or at least a parallel idea, to having a central peg. But bumpers are designed to be kind of random, so they do bounce the ball around a lot more than just a central peg would do. And and why is this called Spanish Eyes? No real reason. Just the art style they chose. This is a table that's also going to really punish you for trying to trap the ball or having the flipper up when the ball isn't somewhere around in front of it. You would have to train yourself not to play that way. Whereas my style of playing pinball tends to generally want to just be a little bit more twitchy and be ready to hit something just in case it might get somewhere near you. This is a table that would definitely force you into having confidence with your flipper shots. There's a problem, certainly, if you were going to play real world pool pinball, and this was the only table you could play, and that's true for pretty much any table. Like, there are some 80s and 90s tables that are so good and so varied and they just have so much going on that you could easily own one of them and be fairly satisfied with that. But pinball tables aren't cheap, so unless you're exceedingly rich, spending somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000 for a pinball table to have it take up a lot of the square footage in your house, particularly if you're only going to have one and you're only going to play it, say, once a week or so, it's hard to justify that expense. If you're an obsessive pinball fanatic and you have developed a habit of consistently playing pinball at some arcade or bar or wherever for several hours every day, then you can justify that expense. But it definitely gets hard for the average person to justify that. On top of which, even if you get a fairly cheap, fairly poor condition pinball table for a couple $1,000, the upkeep and repair and maintenance on that is going to be in the hundreds, perhaps annually, on top of that. So, yeah. In a funny way, this goes to show why video game home consoles were such a big deal. In the old days where you had to go to an arcade to play any kind of video game, the expense was just so high, even though you were just plugging quarters in, or maybe even nickels and pennies into an arcade machine. The variety was never going to be able to be a large amount. An arcade at most could hold 100 cabinets, whereas a modern console or modern PC can have thousands of digital copies of games. So you do have a lack of growth potential for arcade cabinets, whether they're pinball or arcade games, and we just could never make a home console that was for pinball because it was such a physical thing. In the same way that we could make digital versions of football or soccer or tennis or any sport, really, but they aren't the real thing. And having a soccer field or football field, a full professional length soccer field or football field in someone's house is not a realistic, reasonable thing that you could expect to actually see happen. Of course, you could also potentially suggest that is where people became considerably less physically focused, the average person. Of course, that was going to happen anyways. Like, over the time of the 60s and the 70s, there was a considerable movement from everyone being potentially a farmer / sharecropper to feed themselves or work, including families having their children work on their farms too, which was heavily labor intensive, to the movement of having like John Deere tractors and things like that could reduce the amount of work necessary, and that allowed for more people to go to school and seek potential careers that weren't just farming labor careers. There was a brief moment there where that seemed like that would work, but by modern perspective, it seems like the idea of even becoming highly educated for a highly technical job is being quickly replaced by artificial intelligence. And we, with any luck, might hit a point where we hit a post-scarcity society, and humans will be allowed to potentially live a life of luxury without having to do much, or at least a life in which artistry and creativity is the last thing that AI can't replicate quite perfectly. Like, we probably should pass some laws saying that artificial intelligence cannot write scripts and novels and books and things like that before we find out that we're replaced with even that. But like, at a certain point, it might not matter. It might just be that we enjoy the fruits of automation and maybe work very little, or maybe work none at all. At a certain point, we might all get hobbies. We might all rebuild arcades just to have a place to go and hang out. Because you certainly could make an argument that the exact same scenario that has happened to arcades very well should have happened to libraries, and yet that's not the case. Libraries are strong and still going, probably heavily because of government funding and support for the idea of libraries and enthusiasm for the idea of libraries. But there really isn't a great argument as to why every book isn't an ebook, and there would be just like no justification for printing books at all. In the same way that there's little justification these days to make a new pinball table. They still make them. There's still a couple of companies that make them, but they release basically one new model every year at most, and they're selling them to private collectors for the most part, and or they're selling them to the last remaining arcades that exist. And I imagine at this point, if you were to walk up to a pinball table, I wouldn't be surprised if it's $2.50 a play. Just a like ridiculously high amount of money. See, once all of that was lit up, I think I was supposed to hit that center drain, and I didn't. I also think that there was a daily goal of 80,000 points. Okay, so I made 40,000, so I am not doing particularly well on this table. And I'm not super surprised by that either. Like, this is not a table for someone who doesn't want to nudge. And like, this is not a table that's going to tilt you either too much. I guess you can tilt on this one. So 5 balls, you need about 15,000 every ball. On a table like this is fairly hard. There's seemingly very little carryover as far as each ball. Yeah, you can definitely see how this is a table where just there's a lot of places you can try and fling a ball here, and it's just going to hit a weird empty space. This also feels like a table that it would be fairly nice if you could adjust the tilt on it. I suppose that is one of the nice things if you did own a pinball table, is that you could do little tweaks like that. But yeah, if the height on the table, as far as how high it is in the back versus how low it is in the front, was adjusted a little bit, you could ensure or increase the odds of that not really being as difficult. Let's see, we've got all kinds of tips. Well, and we have ball control and pop bumpers. Let's see. Whole scores 500 or 1,000 for each lit star. The hole, I assume, is the one in the middle. Yeah, I probably should do a table exploration at the beginning. This is nice, artsy design. It is also kind of 1970s depiction of, I guess, Spanish people is the idea there. I assume that is not it. In this one, it seems like I can't look at the backboard. So, seems like sometimes the cameras are programmed differently than other times. There's no ball lock on this table. So you will see that too, where there is a distinct decision to add some concepts and then not all concepts into earlier tables, because the amount of toys, as they're called, that they can budget into a specific table is pretty bad. Here's a question. How could we, like, reset? There's kind of no way. I feel like it's weird that you can't add more balls or just play infinitely, even with Pro mode, unless that was something that you only got after you did all the wizard goals on the table, and at that point that seems kind of silly. Like, it's nice that you can use the D-pad to control the ball when you enable that in the Pro mode, as if like you were using a magnet, but I would prefer just an infinite mode. Perhaps even a mode where you could turn off the heads-up display. Which, that's an interesting question. Can we turn off the heads-up display? Let's see, settings. Seems like you could turn tilt off. Multi-camera, event camera, lock camera. Yeah. No way to turn off the heads-up display. I can't fully hate the fact that Pinball Arcade focuses just on recreating the tables as accurately as possible, which is the right move. But I feel like in their waning days, they could have put out a patch for their interface. And compared to like Pinball FX3, that interface I think is just constantly getting updates and improvements to it, or at least they're working on it and thinking about it, where this Pinball Arcade seems like they didn't really focus on that. I'm not even sure that the company that made Pinball Arcade is particularly actively developing anything at this point. I don't think they're completely out of business, and I imagine you could still buy some of these tables, but not all of them, and that was the big issue, certainly. There is also a problem, certainly, having a company making licensed products, because once those licenses end, they almost always are impossible to renegotiate, because people want more money than it was worth in the first place. It would have been wise if the holding companies that own Stern and Midway and Gottlieb, assuming those are just holding companies now that own the licenses to all those tables, and they have negotiated enough licenses to continue to sell the tables that are licensed on top of that, because when you're playing, say, a Star Trek table, then that's Paramount has the license and the rights to Star Trek, I assume, in all forms, or either that or it's the Gene Roddenberry estate that has the license to Star Trek. Either way, a Williams, for example, I'm not sure if Williams really did make a Star Trek table, a Williams Star Trek table would mean that the holding company that owns Williams, assuming Williams is not in business still, which I assume is the case, would then have to renegotiate with Gene Roddenberry or Paramount, who then they would have to turn around and renegotiate licenses with the creators of Pinball Arcade. It just becomes kind of a nightmare, and you can certainly see why Pinball FX wanted to promote and create their own tables, but they just don't make pinball tables that look like pinball tables. Particularly, Pinball FX tables are squished to kind of a widescreen format when they should be an up-down format like this, which there definitely is a way, I don't know exactly how, to put this game into cabinet mode and have a monitor just show the play field of the table and not the edges of the table, and not the floor or the scoreboard. I believe there's even a way to set up a second monitor to display the play field and the score. So there's a lot of kind of secret customization for Pinball Arcade. But oddly, they missed the train quite a bit, because the real success of potentially having home pinball tables would be when AtGames just now in 2021 started selling little child versions of pinball tables, and I'm not sure the AtGames tables could particularly use Pinball Arcade. You could definitely hack it to do it, but I don't think it's going to be anything easy. You probably would have to put a Raspberry Pi or something in there, or a computer itself inside the AtGames pinball cabinet. I don't think I'm going to get these standard goals done today. And I kind of let my feelings be known very early here in calling this a bad table, but it really is a pretty bad table. It's an interesting table, certainly. Something that's fun to say. I've once played Spanish Eyes, but this would be a table at an arcade that I would play with maybe once, probably because it would have been fairly cheap or set to free play. I know a lot of arcades, by the time arcades started dying, were set to free play and just put in like pizza restaurants and places like that. So that there was at a certain point, pizza buffet restaurants were selling very cheap mass quantities of unhealthy pizza, and having arcades that have many of the games, if not all the games, set to free play, so that you could. It was really just a goal to create, I suppose, some brand loyalty, and some, perhaps the parents would drink alcohol, and you'd get some sales there from like a light beer. Well, is there anything else to say about Spanish Eyes? It does seem like these instructions would be cheaper to read. Cheaper as far as time budget is what I mean by that. Just 77 versus 100 pages is, and their pages of like 1 or 2 sentences is not a problem. Also, it is fairly nice that you've got like blinking arrows and the camera moving to show you what they're talking about, because it would be very, very easy to put a line of text and it not make any sense at all. I assume that this whole thing is made in probably the Unity engine, and so a lot of this would be fairly easy to program, relatively easy to program, instead of using your own custom code. Then perhaps there is some kind of secret to the high scores, or it could be that they have painstakingly set the high scores to represent what the high scores would have been for tables. Although in this case, that really couldn't be the case, because this wouldn't have been table that would have kept high scores anyways. It's just far too new for that. Not until you start getting computer memory and LCD screens would you be able to memorize a high score. At least a high score with initials. It would be doable to have an extra spinner reel on the table, on the backboard. And this table also has only one spinner score reel too, so fairly empty backboard. Alright, so if this is 72, then this was 72 also. So then next time Big Shot will be 74. So we are moving forward as far as tables go. And I can say, I think it's fairly worth mentioning that Gorgar is probably the first table I recognize here. This is the first table that had actual speaking sound effects playing it. It would scream Gorgar in a very scratchy, mechanical way. And then, if I'm not mistaken, I think I recognize Black Hole from the 80s. Actually, I may not even know that many 80s tables, although some of these may remind me that they are what they are as I play them. Haunted House sounds like it might be familiar. Also take note that a lot of these pinball tables, if they're not licensed products, which a lot of the early ones were not, are very simplistic names. And that was true for like Atari games and first generation video games also, is that they had very generic names and they needed to eventually put some labels on it. Although even nowadays I see games on Steam that are just like labeled Slide Puzzle or something simplistic like that, and it's kind of ridiculous. I believe I recognize Cyclone here. I am fairly certain I recognize Taxi, and a lot of these I recognize because I've played them on other collections of pinball tables. Here we have an Elvira listing, so that might be the first licensed game even in the 80s era. And then once we start getting into the 90s, here you have a Terminator Judgment Day licensed game. It's kind of hard to read these. Here you have a Doctor Who licensed game. Here you have a Judge Dredd licensed game. There's a TV show nowadays called Rescue 911. Here's Star Trek The Next Generation, Twilight Zone. Yeah, the 90s are really when you start to see some of the best tables. At a certain point in the 2000s, they started trying to put a whole bunch of electronics into... I remember playing Junkyard quite a lot. It was one of the few tables that I had easy access to in my youth and could play quite a bit. But yeah, at a certain point it got a little too crazy and technical and got away from the physical attributes. Then we have the 2000 eras tables, which you can see that there's considerably fewer of those even listed here. In some of these, apparently this is the newest one here, whatever this is labeled as. Yeah, and once my internet starts working again, I'll probably update this and find out that there are some other tables. And I guess I might as well stay consistent. At this point, I have pretty much just committed to having most of my tables in Pinball Arcade, or at least owning all of the ones that Pinball Arcade has to offer. And then there certainly is a consideration for getting Pinball FX3 tables too, if you want newer, more video game-ish style pinball tables. I guess Pinball FX3 is the ultimate evolution of the 2000s tables. There are no 2010s or 2020 pinball tables even listed here. But yeah, Pinball FX puts a lot of animation and a lot of 3D stuff and a lot of interaction that just could not happen in the real world in a lot of their tables that they make. So it has completely broken away from reality. Of course, with every new generation of children who have never actually touched a pinball table, if they have any enjoyment of pinball at all, it probably is going to be first from a digital format and secondarily through an occasional rare instance in which they would have run into a real physical table. And I wouldn't be surprised if most arcades, what little exist, actually don't have any pinball tables, maybe two, and I bet kids aren't very interested in playing them at all. Anyways, that's going to be it for this recording. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want a friend to follow me on any social media sites, there's a whole bunch of links down below. And if you want to support me further, there's a link to Patreon, or you can friend me on Steam and gift me a game off my wishlist. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.